In this video, we're talking about aerobic septic systems, what they are, how they work, and why for dummies. What's going on, guys? Luke here with Luna Environmental. Now, what is an aerobic system in its simplest, most form? Well, the primary thing that differentiates an aerobic septic system from a traditional or a conventional system is simply that in an aerobic system, we are introducing air. We're introducing oxygen at some point in that wastewater treatment process such that we can break things down, clean the water, and distribute it more efficiently. Now, the septic system world is a deep rabbit hole where things get complicated fast. I remember saying to one of our technicians at Luna, hey, do we introduce the air because as the water gets churned up, it's easier to break down the solids? And he said, well, not really. Actually, the air is introduced because when oxygen is put into the system, it's going to create an environment where bacteria, aerobic bacteria, can come in and start to feed and therefore break down the solids in the system. So even though if you open the container lid to look inside of that aerobic chamber, you're going to see the water moving, churning, kind of like a jacuzzi when the jets are turned on, the real reason why we want to efficiently pump a bunch of air in there is because we want to bring in that aerobic bacteria so that we can start to break things down and leverage Mother Nature to clean that wastewater. Now, inside of that big concrete tank underneath the ground that makes up your aerobic septic system, there's 4 primary rooms inside of that big tank. The first one is what we call the pre-treatment tank or the trash tank. This is the tank that holds everything that came from the house. It's the first chamber inside the overall tank. Now, over time, as all of that water and those solids sit inside that tank, many of those solids begin to settle at the bottom, and of course, the water stays at the top. Now, how does the water move from that first tank to the second tank? The second tank is the aeration chamber, where we're going to start introducing some air, some oxygen. There's a T-shaped pipe that sits really kind of at the top of that pre-treatment chamber, such that when the water levels rise and the solids stay down, that water slowly spills over into that aeration chamber. Now, I want to show you guys in real time what this T-shaped pipe looks like, because this actually is one that just got freshly glued by some of our manufacturers out back. You can see how those water levels have to begin to rise. And again, if this is situated more at the top of that wall in the pre-treatment tank, then only water, not the solids, not the sludge, is going to start to enter and spill into that aeration chamber. Now, what happens when we start to introduce air into that aeration chamber? Well, this is where that bacteria starts to feed on all of the waste. And we get to leverage Mother Nature to make this process more efficient. Now, how do we get air into the aeration chamber? Well, we pipe in some PVC all the way down to the bottom of that aeration chamber, and that air is diffused through what we call an air diffuser. Essentially, some PVC air diffusers with stone actually serving as part of the fitting here, because that stone is porous and allows us to pump those bubbles of oxygen into the tank. Now, this little device sits closer to the bottom of that aeration chamber, so as we're putting oxygen in, if you take the lid off, you're going to see those jacuzzi-like bubbles stirring up and churning that water because we're creating some flow here. Now, between the aeration chamber, where we're pumping in that oxygen, and the next tank, which is what we call the clarifier tank, there is a wall that comes down from the top but has an opening at the bottom. Now, at that bottom opening, the clarifier chamber has a slanted bottom that essentially pushes solids back into the aeration chamber that aren't yet broken down. As you can imagine, because there's an opening at the bottom between those two tanks, that aeration chamber is stirring things up, and water and solids to some degree are being pushed underneath that wall into the clarifier tank. But because it's still, just like in the pre-treatment tank, the solids fall down, hit that sloped floor, and slide all the way back into the aeration chamber, such that In the clarifier chamber, or the clarifier tank, we only have those broken down solids and liquids. Now, similar to that trash tank we talked about in the beginning, we've got a T-shaped PVC between the clarifier, which is the third chamber, and then the final tank, which is what we call the pump tank. So we're utilizing the same system to try to only allow the liquids, the treated water, to get through to the pump tank. And what you'll see situated at the bottom of that T-shaped pipe that's moving the water from the third to the fourth and final tank is something that looks just like this, which is essentially a solids blocker, right? If this T-shaped pipe is sitting on the wall situated towards the top of that third chamber, water's moving through, we want to make sure that there's some sort of blockage so that solids don't just move up the pipe with this big opening. So this is why we put this little thin inlet right here to ensure that just treated water is moving through the system and the solids are staying exactly where they're supposed to. Now, as you might imagine, the pump tank is the final tank before the water actually gets distributed in whatever way it gets distributed out into the earth. And so ideally in this tank, we've got, number one, the cleanest amount of water, and number two, the water is fully treated. It's ready to go. There's really no solids in this tank unless we're experiencing some issues further upstream. Now, inside the pump tank is exactly what it sounds, which is a pump, right? In order to push that water out of the tank, because we're not just leveraging gravity and a sloped field, we have to actually have a pump that pulls the water out and throws it into the drip lines or out through the sprinkler heads or whatever way we're distributing that treated waste water. Now, that pump has three different pump floats attached to it that are stacked on top of each other or wrapped around that pump on top of each other. And as the water levels rise, each one of those pumps is responsible for telling the system something important. That first pump rises as the water levels rise, and as the water levels rise to a certain point, that pump float rising triggers the actual pump to turn on and start spraying the water out. So it's actually measuring in real time how much water is rising in the system. And as you might expect, there's another pump float in there that's designed to tell us when the water gets too high. If our first pump float is malfunctioning, we might see that the water levels rise, the float rises, but nothing happens. And so we have some secondary or tertiary floats in there such that when they start to rise, they can tell the system, hey, we're gonna overload the system with water. It's not being pumped out properly. Turn on the pump. And if that pump doesn't get turned on, you might hear a red alarm go off from your control box indicating you've got high water levels, which is when many of our Luna technicians come out to diagnose an issue of why those floats are not turning on and pumping out that water in the pump tank as it should. So that's it, an aerobic septic system for dummies, from the pre-treatment tank to the aeration chamber to the clarifier chamber and finally to the pump tank where all of that treated water gets distributed. Now, what are two very commonly asked questions that a lot of our septic technicians at Luna get? Number one, it's why do I need an aerobic septic system? And while there are many answers we could give, here in Central Texas, the primary reason many homeowners have an aerobic septic system rather than just a conventional system, which is basically a tank underground, is because in Central Texas, we're dealing with a lot of rock, a lot of limestone, which means underground is not quite as absorbent as other parts of the United States. And so we got to figure out different ways to either drip it or spray it out so that it gets evaporated by the sun, and we're not relying on the soil so much to actually treat and filter that wastewater. And one of the second most commonly asked questions we get is, do I have to continue to pump out my tank like I would with a conventional system, even though I've got an aerobic system? And the simple answer is yes. Generally speaking, most of our technicians suggest pumping out the entire system every 3 to 5 years, but of course is dependent on how many people live in the house, how much load we're putting on the system, and other variables that can change house to house. But every septic system is going to have to be pumped eventually as those solids that don't break down continue to build up and therefore cause your system to work harder and harder. Each system needs a reset, no matter which kind it is. All right, guys, there it is, an aerobic septic system for dummies. What it is, how it works, and why we need them. If you got some value from going through this video, hit the like button so that we know we can continue to put out more content like this at Luna, making the world of septic a little less complicated. And from Luke here at Luna Environmental, I'll see you in the next video.